Well, at this point, Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, uh, their faith is faltering a little bit. They've been in the promised land now for about 10 years, having left Ur of the Chaldees, and they're still waiting for the promises of God to be fulfilled. And we talked about that last week. And if you remember in last week's study, if you were with us, in the first few verses of chapter 15, God reassured Abram that he and Sarah would indeed have a child that would be Abram's heir, and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. And then in verse 6, Abram believed in the Lord. By faith, Abram believed what God said. He believed the promise of God that he would have a child and that his descendants would be like the stars of the sky. And so now that brings us to verse 7, where we pick it up today. And beginning in verse 7, God makes a covenant with Abram. You know, God in His grace and God in His kindness actually condescends down to Abram's level and enters into an official, binding, legal covenant with Abram. You know, God puts His promise in writing, so to speak. God signs His name on the contract here in this chapter. Now, before we look at the details, though, of this covenant and get into that, I want to remind you that Genesis was penned by Moses, right, in the wilderness. After they came out of Egypt, they're at Mount Sinai. Moses receives the law on Mount Sinai. And so it's penned by Moses. And the original audience then of Genesis were the children of Israel, who God brought out of Egypt and brought out of slavery, who have just entered into this covenant with God at Mount Sinai, and they're on their way to the promised land. Okay? So just tuck that away and remember that, because it's helpful for understanding kind of a dimension to this story here. So now God enters into a covenant, an official covenant with Abram. In verse 7, God begins the covenant with Abram by saying, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit it. Now, in Exodus, when God made the covenant at Mount Sinai that I just referred to, God began that covenant by saying in Exodus 20, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of your house of bondage. So God used the same wording for that covenant at Mount Sinai that He uses here when He makes this covenant with Abraham. And I would guess that as the children of Israel read Genesis 15 for the first time, the covenant at Sinai is fresh on their mind because they just made that covenant. And I'm sure these words were familiar to them. And they would think God's making a covenant with Abram, just like He just made a covenant with us at Mount Sinai. So God says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit. And God is speaking with authority here. He says, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh. And He reminds Abram that He brought him out of Ur of the Chaldees. In other words, God initiated this relationship with Abraham. God started this. It wasn't the other way around. Abraham didn't initiate the relationship with God. God initiated it with Abraham when He called him to leave Ur of the Chaldees. You know, in John chapter 15, you know what Jesus says to His disciples? You did not choose me, I chose you. God started the relationship with us. We didn't, it's not the other way around. We didn't start this relationship with God. God initiated the relationship with us. He chose us. And He called us out of the world. He called us out of sin to be His disciples. And if you're a disciple here today, or you're watching online, you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, God could say to you, I am the Lord who brought you out of Where did he bring you out of, right? Where were you when God called you? What did he call you out of? What did he bring you out of? I am the Lord who brought you out of whatever. Despair, addiction, loneliness, depression, pride. Wherever you were when God called you and saved you, God could say to you this, just as he says to Abram or Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out. He brought us out of our old life. He brought Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees. And in verse 7, God promises to give Abram and his descendants the land of Canaan as an inheritance. His descendants being the Jewish people. So this is the land covenant that God makes with the Jewish people. This covenant is still very important today. It's very important today. The Jewish people of today claim that they have a right to the land of Israel, in part because of this covenant that God made with Abram and his descendants thousands of years ago. They claim it's divinely given to them, a divine right to the land. In fact, if you go on the Minister of Foreign Affairs website for the State of Israel, their official government website, when it talks about the history of their nation, they start out with Abraham. Just as if somebody on our website, on a government website, we're talking about the history of the United States, we usually start with 1776, Declaration of Independence. On their government website, they start with the land covenant that God made with Abraham. So it's still a factor today. God promised the land to Abram's descendants, and it's a perpetual covenant that's still in effect today. Now in verse 8, Abram asks a question. He said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? I don't believe this is a question of doubt. I don't think he's doubting God's promise here to give his descendants the land. Remember in verse 6, Abram believed God. This is not a question of doubt. This is a question of curiosity. How are you going to do it, Lord? How will I inherit this land? How will my descendants inherit this land? Much like the question that Mary, the mother of Jesus, asked when the angel Gabriel said that she would give birth to the Messiah. She said, how? Not that she was doubting, but how are you going to do it, seeing that I've never known a man? How am I going to have a child? And I think in the same way here, Abram asks, how? He's curious. How is this going to play out? So he said to him, verse 9, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And then he brought all these to him and cut them in two down the middle and placed them each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. Now I intended to get some of these animals and actually do that for you here, just to kind of we had a hard time getting a permit for that, but apparently you can't really do that in Howard County.